Good afternoon. I thought I'd take a minute today to discuss some options in tool making, specifically tools like axes and adzes. There are two schools of thought. One is forge welding, and the other is all one-piece construction out of tool steel so that there are no welds. And I thought I'd discuss the pros and cons of why you might prefer welding and why you might prefer the all tool steel version. And this is kind of a discussion for blacksmiths as well as a discussion for those who use the tools. Most of my customers are woodworkers, specifically green woodworkers for the axes and the adzes, and I thought I would discuss why I may choose one versus another and why you may prefer one versus the other. Before we get too serious into that discussion, and it'll probably not be a very long video today, I just wanted to take care of a few administrative details, so to speak. First, I would like to thank all of you who have subscribed to the channel. We are now over 1,000 viewers, which from YouTube standards is quite small, but for a fairly new channel and a fairly new effort, that's a major milestone. So thank you very much for subscribing and following the videos. Thanks to those who share the videos with their friends. I really appreciate that. I know I was planning on doing a video on making a hammer as my next video, but I really need to get some things completed and out to customers, because the paying customers are the ones who are supporting the YouTube effort mostly. And since what I've got to do are axes and adzes, I thought I would just take a brief moment to discuss those. So the question at hand is forge welded versus all one-piece tool steel. And on the table here I have a few examples of each. And probably for most people, just looking at what's laying here, you can't really tell the difference between what is and what isn't forge welded unless you are somewhat knowledgeable about how these things are made. Forge welding, if you're not familiar with it, is a process of bringing two pieces of material up to a high heat so that the surfaces will bond under the impact of a hammer. This is an age-old way of making axes, adzes, and any other tool. Even tools like chisels typically were forge welded. Steel was very expensive. Wrought iron was not so expensive, so it was worth the extra effort to forge weld in just enough steel to make the cutting edge. That's not as popular today because steels have become less expensive and labor has become much more expensive. So a lot of the tool makers out there now offer only a solid tool steel version, and industry only offers solid tool steel versions. You won't find any big industry that I know of making axes, adzes as a mass-produced item who's still forge welding. But even as recently as probably 60 or 70 years ago, there were some that were still being made by forge welding. So here's some examples. This is the classic forge welded axe right here. It's a small trade axe. You might call it a tomahawk. It's wrapped up, forge welded across here, so that it's one long piece, and I wish I had one that wasn't finished. Wrapped, welded through here. A high carbon tool steel insert is put in, and that is then forge welded. And that could be done. This is also a wrapped eye axe, so the same kind of procedure. The thing you're seeing on the edge is protected so I don't cut myself when I'm working on handles. But that can also be done with a punched eye axe. This axe, the eye was punched through hot, but it's still a mild steel axe, and you can see in this split here will accept the high carbon tool steel bit, and that'll be forge welded. And we can do the exact same thing. We can punch this out of tool steel, and we can draw all this out, and we don't have to split that. We can save that time by just doing this all out of one piece of tool steel. So why one versus the other? That's the big question. As I mentioned, forge welding is the old way of doing it. Blacksmiths have been forge welding for centuries. The early tools, it was the only way they were going to make them. Materials didn't come in great big quantities, and stacking up or wrapping to form an eye was much more practical than trying to get a big hunk of steel and punching an eye through it. Plus, wrought iron was the common material. Tool steels were very rare. In fact, tool steel is a misnomer, really. Just very cheap, poor quality steels is all they had. Over the centuries, we've developed much better steels, and we can now make tools out of all tool steel. But historically, axes, chisels, draw knives, adzes, all of these things were made from at least two-piece construction. There are some axes, big goose wing axes, that are 4 or 5 pieces, all forge welded together to pull that off. And that's one of the big advantages of forge welding. It allows some designs to be done in a smaller shop that would be horribly impractical out of a single piece. When you start having something even like this, I could do this out of a single piece of steel, but that's a big piece of tool steel to forge. It's more difficult to forge. It's way more expensive. It only needs tool steel right through here, and only at the cutting edge. The whole blade doesn't have to be tool steel. So this is a laminate. If I'm doing big goose wing axes, which I haven't done yet, but I would like to, that is certainly something that would be very impractical to do without forge welding. So forge welding does open up some designs. The other advantage to forge welding, from a user's point of view, is the body of the tool is a softer, tougher material, which means it's not going to crack. It'll take some abuse. It may bend and warp if you abuse it badly, but it's not going to break. Whereas a tool steel axe, if you abuse it, may crack across here somewhere, or knock chips out of the pole if you're using it like a hammer. Axes are not hammers, they're axes. This is the end you work with, not this end. So by having this tougher mild steel body and a hard tool steel edge, we can actually leave this edge a little harder because it's protected by the mild steel or wrought iron body historically, and you get a keener cutting edge that way. So that's one big advantage, and probably the biggest advantage from the user's point of view. As a blacksmith, a lot of it's the artistic advantage that it opens up new doors for me. Now, what's the disadvantage to forge welding? Well, this is a wrapped eye axe, just like the tomahawk is a wrapped eye. And that means when you put a handle in here, if you are overly aggressive when you wedge that handle, there is a slim chance that you will split the weld. Forge welds should be as strong as the parent material, but if there's any inclusions or trapped junk in the weld, or if something just didn't go right, it may not be obvious, and you can damage an eye that way. And I've only had that happen once, so it's not a serious problem, but it is a theoretical problem that you might split an eye. Not your eye, the axe eye. So that's probably the biggest disadvantage to forge welding from a customer's point of view. Sometimes it's just purely aesthetics. This axe is forge welded, and I don't know if we can zoom in to see this. But right at the front of the eye here, you can see where the seam comes together. Now that's really not a problem. That doesn't mean the axe is ready to fall apart. It's just an area that doesn't weld real readily right at the edge of the eye, and sometimes you can see that evidence. There are lots of historical axes out there that have been used for ages and are still usable, and you can see that. It's not a big deal. But some people don't like to see that. They see that as a flaw. They see that as something that they want to avoid. I'll try to zoom out here again. So from an aesthetic point of view, some people just don't like the looks of the forge weld. You can also see in this axe, this is a broad axe, so the tool steel is applied just to the one side. And you can see where the scarf or the edge of the weld is right here. And again, that's aesthetics. That's not going to hurt the axe. Lots of historic axes out there. You can see the weld lines. It's no big deal. This will last for hundreds of years and lots of use. I mean, you got that much to sharpen before the thing's worn out. But some people don't like that. They think it's a flaw. They say, oh my God, it's got a crack. Well, it's not a crack. It's just a scarf line. It's a sign of how it was made. It's character. But if you don't like character in your axe and you want something else, then maybe a forge welded axe isn't for you. Another way axes are forge welded, this is an asymmetric eye. Instead of the full wrap, it's just wrapped part way. And that's the way these Viking style axes were done. And that's based on the teachings of James Austin. I took a class from him. And these really close up quite well. Using his procedures, you hardly ever see the sign of the eye. So it's not always a problem. And frankly, I would not want to do this axe as a punched eye, because it's a historical styled axe based on original pieces, and the original pieces were done this way. They were not done with a punch out of a big piece of tool steel. So historical accuracy is another reason you might choose forge welding over a single one-piece axe. So what are the advantages of one-piece construction? Well, the big one is you don't have any forge welds. You're not going to get any sign of it. If the forge weld is a little less than perfect, you're not going to have to worry about an eye opening up or a little corner of the blade showing a little bit of seam or something like that. So that you might prefer the all one piece in that case. The disadvantage to a one-piece axe is that it's a lot harder to forge as far as physical labor. It is a little bit faster because you don't have to worry about the forge weld, but tool steels do not move under the hammer the way mild steel does. So again, there's some limiting factor there that you're not going to get the same shapes and the same performance in forging that you would with the mild steel and the welded construction. You can still come up with pretty much the same basic shapes. You know, an axe like this, or this axe is a solid one-piece tool steel axe. It's all a piece of O1 tool steel. And this adze is all O1 tool steel. After looking at what I brought out to show you, I think these are the only tools that are done out of single piece tool steel. I think everything else here has a forge, well no, the big slick chisel is single piece. Although the socket is forge welded. So there's still forge welding involved. Sorry if I'm rambling. So it's a little bit simpler from the user's point of view. If you've got an all tool steel axe, it's less likely to deform if you're abusing it and pounding on the pole of the axe. Again, that's not what it's for. And if you use a wooden club, you're not going to hurt it. But using this as a hammer to drive steel is not what an axe is meant for. But if you're going to do that, an all tool steel axe might make sense. And all tool steel axes, generally when I make them, I will harden this portion of the axe, the blade portion, more so than I will the eye. And I will often insert a red hot drift back into the eye after hardening to draw more temper in the eye so it is a little bit softer and less likely to crack. And that does solve a lot of the problems. So that's just a real basic look at some of the pros and cons of forge welding versus all one-piece tool steel construction. Most of the axe makers out there seem to be making axes these days all tool steel. And I think it's more efficient for a blacksmith to do it that way, even though you may have the skills to forge weld. A lot of them just don't want to take the time because they've got customers waiting for tools, and it does eliminate some of the iffiness of the forge weld that some customer may not like seeing that sign of a forge weld, or you may end up with a bad forge weld. Odds are you ruin a couple axes per 100 because the forge weld doesn't take, and they go in the scrap pile and you make another one. But just some of the risk there. So I think that's why a lot of makers choose all tool steel axes. I've done them both ways. I still do them both ways, and I will probably continue to do that. However, I am curious if, as other blacksmiths, as the users of the tools, what is it you want in a tool? Do you prefer more traditional forge welded construction? This is the adze is 2-piece. The draw knife is 2-piece. It's mild steel out here with a forge welded tool steel back. Is that what you prefer because it's more traditional? Do you like the fact that it's got tougher steel, and that in the case of the draw knife you could actually bend those handles a little bit without breaking them if you wanted to change the angle yourself, which isn't highly recommended, but that is an advantage to the forge welded construction? Or do you prefer the all tool steel version because there are no forge welds? You're guaranteed that eye isn't going to break apart because you drove that wedge in with a sledgehammer to make sure your handle never moves. Or is there some other reason you prefer it? I'd love to hear from you. I am in business making axes and adzes. It doesn't do me any good to make them just the way I like them, even though I will continue to do that and have some that are for sale that are solely because I wanted to make this axe, even though most of my customers want this axe. And I'll make both. So let me know. Comment in the comments here. I'm going to share this on Facebook in a few places, so if you're reading it in one of the Facebook groups, comment to the post in Facebook. If you're seeing something in my Instagram on it, comment in my Instagram. That doesn't really matter. Send me an email if you want to. I would love to hear from you. I'm really curious on what people really want in their tools. You're the people that I need to be working with. I always make tools that please me, but I have to make tools that please you as well. So just let me know. And I thank you for watching it. We will get back to real blacksmithing in the short future, but I'm going to try and get some axes and adzes made this week, and so maybe next week before we do that hammer video I promised you. In the meantime, subscribe to the channel, like the video. If you think it sucks, well, you got to give it a thumbs down. It's the only way I know. And please comment, and then go watch some other videos. Talk to you later.